Okay, there we go. Now we're recording. So I guess we'll just open it up. For chapter 1, hold on, let me look at these things here. 1 second. We've got messages are also okay. Anyway, let me present my screen, and then what we'll do is we will start with chapter 1. I'll ask you if you guys have any specific questions for chapter 1. Then we'll go to chapter 2. Then we'll go to chapter 3. And if there are no questions, or once I've answered all your specific questions, then I'll just go back and try to answer everything until we run out of time. So here we go. Does anybody have any questions for chapter 1? All right. Does anybody have any questions for chapter 2? Okay. Does anybody have any questions for chapter 3?
Okay, wait. Sorry, I had to look at my notes. For
okay.
chapter 1,
Uh-huh.
I have a question. So I know we have to know like the scientific method, but for every like each step, we have to know that and the definitions.
No, as a matter of fact, it's not even the definitions that I really care that you know about. It's sort of like in the study guide where it gives you an example of all these different steps of an actual somebody actually using the scientific method, and you need to determine which step is which. So let me see if I can find that.
Okay. So it'll be more like a scenario kind of thing.
Exactly. So like this one right here, you try to start your car, but it does not start. All right. So instead of just addressing this question specifically, I'll just talk about it in general. You try to start your car, but it doesn't start. That's an observation, right? So then if you were to ask yourself, why isn't my car starting? That's obviously a question. If you were to say, my car's battery is dead, that is a hypothesis. And remember, because a hypothesis is a tentative answer to a question, right? It's an answer to a question that you can test. So that is an answer to a question you can test, right? You can say, my car's battery is dead. You can test that answer. And then a prediction is sort of like rewording your hypothesis, but it's more specific because it's going to, in your prediction, you kind of talk about how you are going to test your hypothesis. So in this case, the prediction will be B, and it's usually an if-then statement. If I recharge the battery, then my car will start, right? Because you could have all kinds of predictions for that hypothesis. You could put, if I replace the battery, then my car will start. Or if I put this battery into another car, then that car won't start. So that you can see there that from this one hypothesis, which is just the initial answer to the question, you can come up with multiple predictions. So I'm glad you asked that question. So yes, you will almost definitely get a question like this on the exam. Obviously, it's not going to be you tried to start your car because we already used that in the study guide, and it won't be you tried to turn on your TV because that's the example we used in the lecture. But it'll be something like that. And yeah, you'll need to identify the one or some of, right, the observation, the question, the hypothesis, and the prediction. Oh yeah. And
okay, really, thank you.
You're welcome. And I also should point out where it says right here, my car is too old to function properly. That is a tentative answer to the question of why won't your car start. But the problem with that statement is it's not the reason it's not a hypothesis is you can't really test that. You can't say that it's too old. I mean, sure, that might be the reason your battery is dead because it's too old, or something else is wrong because it's too old. But really the only thing you can prove is that this component's not working or this component's not working, whatever the case may be. So great question. Does anybody else have any questions? I guess from any of the study guides. All right. I guess I'll just go through them one at a time then. I don't mind doing it. For your sake, I don't like doing it because I'm not going to have time to go through every single question. So just keep that in mind moving forward for the next time we meet for an exam review. It's really good to take notes like I think it was Johnson did, so you know what questions to ask me. Otherwise, we're going to do what I'm about to do, which is just go through every single question, from beginning to end, and probably not get them all. That being said, well, it's a little bit too late now because the exam is tomorrow, but generally speaking, if after we've had an exam review, if I didn't answer any questions or you thought of a question after the exam review, I'm always here to help. Technically I'm still always here to help tonight too, but anyway, just wanted to say that. Also, really quickly, like I said, you can get extra credit for this. So if it's going to be 2.4 points, just as if, it was attendance, except instead of those points being applied to your attendance, they'll be applied to your independent work. So if you're watching this video or if you're here in person, just send me an email that says, I watched the exam review. Please apply the extra credit to my independent work. Or, I don't know, to whatever you want. So you get 2.4 points in the email. Just tell me where you want me to apply it. Okay, moving forward, let's talk about these questions. In what way is the science of biology related to our society? Not on the exam, not worth talking about. What is biology? You need to know biology. That's one of the first things I told you in the semester. It is the scientific study. Oops, where'd it go? The scientific study of life, right? So not just the study of life, but the scientific study of life. Any questions about that? All right. Oh, sorry. Yeah?
Professor D.
Yeah.
Could you scroll through the questions without reading them, like 5 at a time or however many is on one page? And if one of us have a question about something we see, let us ask it instead of going through one of them one at a time.
I'm afraid to do that, though, because that might waste time as well.
Okay.
But
no problem.
Although I'm torn, because that is a good idea, because then I'm not going through every single question. But then again, I'm also just scrolling through. I don't know. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll move forward. Let me think about that for the next time. I'm sorry.
Okay.
But that is a good idea. I just have to think about it. And unfortunately, I don't really have time to do that right now. You definitely need to know this, number 3, which is not a property of life, right? So here's a whole list, a partial list of the full list that you got from the exam or from the textbook. Populations of organisms rarely change over time. That is the answer, because that is not a property of life because of that word rarely, right? Because populations of organisms do change over time, right? We learned that they do evolve. Therefore, A is the correct answer because of that word rarely. Now, I could change this answer to say which is not a property of life, and get rid of that word rarely, in which case that wouldn't be the answer. So that's one of the ways I might reword that question. Number 4 won't be on the exam. No need to talk about it. Number 5, what substance is not recycled? That won't be on the exam either. We'll talk about that later in the semester. Number 6, yes, I did say in the lecture that the most basic unit of life is the cell. So the answer is cell. Cells do need DNA molecules to work. They do need organelles to work. They do need a nuclei to work. All those things are needed for a cell to work. But a DNA molecule can't perform everything, that is needed for life. Only a cell can do that with the help of these other things and some other things that also are not listed. So the answer to 6 is B, and you should know that. Any questions so far? Okay, number 7, that's going to be in chapter 4. You can read it if you want. We're going to skip it. It's not going to be on the exam. Number 8, we're going to talk about genes later, but genes are composed of DNA. That won't be on this exam. A reliable source. Here's one that a lot of people missed, and I think it's because they misread the question. A reliable source about the usefulness of an herbal supplement is likely to be recognizable by all but one of these characteristics. So all but one. In other words, this is a list of reasons where you could say, oh yeah, that's reliable, except one. Like choose the thing that's not like the other. So the information is a primary source. No, that's good, right? That does indicate that it's, it does indicate that it's a reliable source. The information is published in a peer-reviewed journal. Nope, that also is an indication that it's a reliable source. Many references are cited. Yeah, that is also an indication that it's a reliable source. The authors are employed by the manufacturer of the supplement. No, right? So that's the answer, because first of all, with any multiple choice question, usually you could say which one of these things is not like the other. And this one's it, right? These 3 things say, yep, that's reliable. This says, well, whoever wrote that paper might be biased because they are literally employed by the manufacturer of the supplement that they wrote the paper about. So obviously I could reword that question. It won't be about supplements. And maybe, I could turn A into the correct answer by saying the information is not a primary source, right? In which case that would be the exception. Any questions about number 9? All right, question 10. We're going to talk about evolution later, so I'm going to skip that and won't be on this exam. Same thing on number 11. We'll talk about that later in the semester. Same thing for number 12. We'll talk about that later in the semester. 13, same story. The only thing I will say about all those questions that I just missed or skipped over for your own knowledge, since you've done the study guides, the big thing there is individuals do not evolve. You don't evolve. A single dinosaur never evolved. Only populations evolve. That's when they change over time. Now, individuals do change, but that doesn't mean they are evolving. And I'll get back into that later in the semester. Number 14, this is a pretty good one. Yet you need to know what science is. And it is A, the inquiry-based effort to describe and explain nature. Yeah, I like the search for truth, sort of, but truth is sometimes a subjective term. I don't know. I think your book included that choice because it's not very to the point. So even though you could argue that science is the search for truth, it's not as good as an answer as A, the inquiry-based effort to describe and explain nature. Science does have an organized set of principles of how to behave ethically and morally, but that is not what it is itself, right? There's plenty of unethical and morally wrong science that has been done over the years. Think about not most recently, but relatively recently, the Tuskegee experiment, right? Look that up if you don't know what it is. So yes, the answer to 14 is A. Any questions so far? Okay, number 15 is about evolution. That won't be on this exam. 16, which of these is correct? Scientific ideas are subjected to repeated testing. That is correct, right? You can't just prove you can't do an experiment that supports your hypothesis and then it's just done, right? Most likely it'll get tested again. Science can be used to prove or disprove the idea that deities exist, blah, blah, blah. No, we can't. We said that at the beginning of the semester, right? Maybe deities or spirits did cause earthquakes, but science can't confirm that because there's no way to prove it or disprove it. Science does not require observations that other people can confirm. Incorrect, right? I could change this into the correct answer by putting science does require observations that other people can confirm. And D, this is crazy. Only exploratory science can lead to important conclusions about nature. That is not true. So any questions about number 16? All right, number 17, which statement is a valid scientific hypothesis? Human history is determined by a series of supernatural events. No, that is not, because we can't prove or disprove that, right? B, humans should help in the conservation of other animal species. It's a true statement. I believe that to be true. But that's not a hypothesis, right? That's more of a judgment, right? That's more of it's sort of like that other question. That's a guide on how to be morally, how to do the right thing morally, right? You should conserve things. Sure, you should, but that's not a hypothesis. You can't test it. Humans are controlled by forces beyond our understanding. Nope. Just like A, we can't test that. Therefore, it's not a valid scientific hypothesis. It might be true, but we can't test it. We can't falsify it. Therefore, it's not a hypothesis. Humans and bacteria share a common genetic code. First of all, that is true. And more importantly, it is a valid scientific hypothesis. I could put that humans and bacteria, I don't know. I don't want to get into it. We don't have time. Anyway, any questions about number 17? All right, number 18, we've already discussed. You do need to know observation, question, hypothesis, prediction. Speaking of which, number 18, you have to recognize a hypothesis or prediction. Number 19 asks you the definition of a hypothesis, but like I think Johnson asked earlier, most likely I'm not going to ask you the definition. I'm more than likely ask you to recognize it like you would in number 18. But a hypothesis is, yes, it is a proposed explanation for a set of observations. No, a lot of people guess this. It is not B. They put a guess made in order to determine what observations and explorations are necessary. The reason why that's not the correct answer is because observation / exploration, that's the first step in the scientific method. So obviously, you're not going to have a hypothesis that's going to lead you to lead you backwards, basically. Also, it's not an observation in order to determine a theory, and it is not a theory that is determined after data collection. Simply put, it's a proposed explanation for a set of observations, and also that's not listed on here. It is, you can test it, and it's falsifiable. You can prove that it's false. So, any questions about number 19? All right, number 20, which sequence shows the step of the process of science in the order in which they might occur? Yes, you do need to know the steps of the scientific process in order. And I like the way they wrote this question because even though there's one of those choices is in order, it's not complete. So it doesn't have every step, but it has some of the steps and they're in order. And that's all the question asks, right? Choose the one that's in order. Experiment conclusion, so far so good. Exploration, no, that's the first step. Question, observation, no, observation is the first step. Exploration, good. Hypothesis, good. Prediction, yes. Experiment. So the answer is C. And of course, exploration, that word could be substituted for observation, right? Because like I said at the beginning of the semester, in this class, those words are interchangeable. And look, they skipped a step, right? They skipped the step of question. But again, this is in the right sequence, and that's what the question asks for. What's in the right sequence, not which one has all the steps. So any questions about number 20? All right, number 21, this one's fairly important. How do hypotheses differ from theories? I think I clearly remember saying this in lecture. I said if you're taking notes, you could write this down. Basically, theories are more comprehensive than hypotheses, right? Hypotheses are very specific. It's a very specific answer to a very specific question. Theories are very much more broad in scope. Like the theory of gravity explains a lot of different hypotheses. The theories of evolution explains a lot of different hypotheses. We'll leave it at that. So any questions about number 21? Actually, let me address some of these other bad choices. Theories do need to be testable. That's true. But then it says hypotheses do not need to be testable. That is a false statement. Hypotheses do need to be testable. Hypotheses are not necessarily educated guesses. I think your book, whoever wrote this study guide, included that because that's one of the common things that we've been misled our whole life. Hypotheses are not necessarily educated guesses. They are more like tentative explanations, all right? So anyway, hypotheses are derived from experimentation, whereas theories are derived from observation. Incorrect. Observation is always the first step, regardless if you're talking about hypothesis or theory. So any questions about number 21? Number 22 is all about evolution, natural selection. We'll talk about that later. Won't be on this exam. 23 won't be on this exam. 24 won't be on this exam. 25 will not be on this exam. So does anybody have, a little bit more. I'm going to address these really quickly. I can almost guarantee, none of these questions are going to be on the exam, but I don't even really have time to talk about the questions, because to do that, we would have to talk about this whole written thing right here. So just don't worry about that. It won't be on the exam. If any of you are curious as to why you missed these questions, please let me know. I would love to talk to you about it because you can learn from it. But this particular meeting is devoted strictly to preparing you for the exam. So I will not discuss that right now. Same with this. It's another situation where they present an experiment, a study, and then they ask you questions about it. So it won't be on the exam. We're not going to talk about it. These really should have been in a different section. You do need to know this. A study may be pseudoscience if what? The evidence is anecdotal. Yeah. So remember, like if I said, listen, my aunt got really sick when she got the COVID shot, that would be anecdotal evidence, right? You didn't see that from any official source. That's just me telling you a story. The results are published in a journal where studies are reviewed by other experts in the field. Nope, probably not pseudoscience if it went through peer review. The experimenters used controlled experiments. Nope, probably not pseudoscience if it actually went through a controlled experiment, a good, proper experiment. And again, statistical analyses are performed on experimental results. No, that is an indication that it's not pseudoscience. Because the opposite of this would be, instead of doing statistical analysis on the results, people cherry picked the data and, said, well, look, I told you the COVID shot makes you sick. And it, picked out the few times that the COVID shot has made people sick and didn't talk about the many other times that it didn't make people sick, as an example. So any questions about number 39? You should be able to recognize pseudoscience. And in my opinion, that's nothing you need to study from the textbook, right? That's just use your common sense. If something seems like it could be misleading or misleading basically, then it could be pseudoscience. Number 40, not on this exam. We'll talk about that later. Number 41. Yes, I'm going to be some version of this. Suppose a scientist wanted to determine if a substance retrieved from outer space is alive. Which of these properties of the substance would not help her make that determination? So basically, this is asking the other question that we talked about earlier, which is you just need to understand and recognize the properties of life. It's the same question, just asked a different way. So she found this thing. It has clear, orderly arrangement. Yeah, that's a property of life. So that's not the answer. It maintains a constant temperature. Yeah, that is another property of life. It has a lot of colors. No, that is not a property of life. And it's cellular. That is a property of life. So the answer is C. So again, you should know. There's not going to be a question where I ask you to list all the properties of life, but it will be something like this, where you get a multiple choice and you need to choose the one that is not a property of life. Or maybe I'll do it around the other way and have a bunch of things that are not true, and then you choose the one that is a property of life. So any questions about chapter 1? We're making decent time. Let's jump into chapter 2 study guide. And while I'm doing that, can someone still reconfirm that you can hear me and see the screen? Because I've been having a lot of technical issues today.
All good.
Thank you, sir. All right, chapter 2. Again, I'll ask before I get started. Does anybody have any specific questions about chapter 2? All right. That's going to be out of order. No, it's not. Okay. Here we go. How can radiation be controlled and safely used in medicine? Not going to be on the exam. I don't think I'm going to ask you an example of an element, but the answer is nitrogen. I guess maybe the reason you should know this is because we talked about water. You know that's a compound, a molecular, a covalent molecule, to be exact. And you know glucose is another molecule with covalent bonds, and you know salt is an ionic compound. So yeah, even though we didn't talk about nitrogen, we did talk about water, glucose, and salt. So not necessarily that you needed to memorize that nitrogen is an element, but because we talked about those other things, and you should know them as an example maybe, then yeah. Anyway, number 3, the big 4, what are they? And you need to know this. The answer is, let's see, nitrogen, oxygen, nope. Carbon, oxygen, yeah, the answer is B. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. Those are the big 4. So most of your body weight is made up of those 4 elements. Any questions about that? And don't get me wrong, they tried to be tricky. Phosphorus, that is one of the elements in your body. It's just not one of the big 4. Potassium, calcium, one of the elements in your body, not one of the big 4. Same thing again, calcium. Number 4, which of the following elements is a trace element? I probably want to ask you this because in the lecture I said that I'm not going to require you to memorize the entire list. But the answer is iron. But yeah, I'm probably not going to ask you that because we talked about every single one of these. We talked about phosphorus, carbon, iron, and calcium. So I don't think it's fair for you to remember which one was a trace element versus the step in between a trace element and one of the big 4. So I'm not going to ask you that. In order to have a positive charge, you need to know this, right? You need to know how an atom would have a positive charge or a negative charge, right? So to have a positive charge, it must have more protons and electrons. And I could reword that to say fewer protons and electrons, in which case that would still be the correct answer, but it would be worded a different way. And of course, I could reword the question to say, in order to have a negative charge, an atom must have, right? So the idea here is don't memorize this exact question. Just understand what an atom needs to be positive or negative. So if it has more electrons, it's negative. If it has more protons, it's positive. And another way of saying that, if it has fewer protons it is negative. If it has fewer electrons, it is positive. Does anybody have questions about number 5? Okay. Number 6, you need to know this, and the way I worded it in the lecture was, an element is defined by its number of what? And the answer is B, protons. All atoms have the same number of protons. Not neutrons, because if you change the number of neutrons, you get yourself an isotope. If you change the number of electrons, you get yourself an ion. So the answer is protons. Any questions about number 6? Question 7, I did say you need to know this. Basically, what's inside of a nucleus of an atom? And the answer is protons and neutrons. So remember, protons and neutrons on the inside, electrons orbiting around the outside. And I assume none of you will miss that because you probably got sick of drawing all that and learning about that in lab. So hopefully you can remember that electrons on the outside and everything else is on the inside. Any questions about number 7? I like this. This is tricky. Even I screw this up when I'm grading sometimes. I'm not as much now because I'm getting used to it. But beryllium's atomic mass is 9. Its atomic number is 4. How many protons are found in the beryllium atom? The way they worded this, it's tricky. Like it really is a trick question because it leads you to believe that you're going to have to do some math. And then probably your brain remembers the math that I talked about in the lecture where I said, all right, protons plus neutrons equals the atomic mass. But here, they mislead you because they're not talking about the atomic mass at all. In fact, the only thing they're telling you is the atomic, well, see, they give you the atomic mass, then they give you the atomic number. If it was a math question, we could say how many neutrons are found in beryllium, in which case the answer would be 5, right? Because 5 neutrons plus 4 protons equals 9. But in this case, they say how many protons are found in a beryllium atom. And it's right here because what you need to know to answer this question, is that the atomic number equals how many protons, right? That's what you need to know. So any questions about number 8? Be aware of that for the exam. There will be some version of that question. I will not use beryllium. I'll use something else. I'll give you all the pertinent information, the numbers that you need like this in this question. And I might not ask about the protons. I might ask what the atomic mass is, or I might ask how many neutrons it is. So just read it carefully when you see it on the exam, just like this one. You've got to read it carefully. Any questions about that, about number 8?
Yes. So
yes.
The answer was 9.
No, the answer is 4. Because it's saying how many protons. And what you need to know for this is the number of protons equals the atomic number for every single.
Okay, got you.
Okay. And it doesn't matter, not just beryllium, but for everything. The atomic number tells you how many protons it has.
Thank you for clearing that up because I was about to ask the same question.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad you guys asked. Yeah. The atomic number equals how many protons it has. And the atomic mass is the atomic number plus the number of neutrons. Okay, good. I'm so glad we talked about that one. Number 9, this one's a little bit math involved as well. An uncharged atom of mercury. All right, so that means if it's saying uncharged, that means we know the protons equals the electrons. So keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward. An uncharged atom of mercury has an atomic number of 80. All right, there we go right away. Oh, excuse me, and an atomic mass of 200. This atom has blank protons, so we know it has 80, right? Because we know the atomic number is 80, therefore it must have 80 protons. We also know, because it says it's uncharged, that if it has 80 protons, it also must have 80 electrons. So we know that these two are 80 and 80. We know the atomic mass is 200. So then the question is 80 plus what equals 200, right? And the answer is 80 plus 120. So the answer to this is A. And I know I went through that quickly, but you guys see how that worked, right? This part right here, the protons and the electrons, all that information was basically given to you in the question. And then you had to do the math to figure out the neutrons. And then you might see a question like that on the exam, but it won't be about mercury. It'll be about a different element. But I'll still give you all the numbers that you need. So any questions? Number 10, I'm going to skip that. It won't be on the exam. Isotopes. Again, you need to know that isotopes, they have the same number of protons, obviously, because if you change the number of protons, you change the element. but they have a different number of neutrons. So the answer to 11 is A. And think about I could reword that to say isotopes of an element have different numbers of blank and the same number of blanks. It's still asking the same thing, but I might swap the order, for example, just to make sure that you're paying attention to the question and that you didn't just memorize this question verbatim without actually understanding what you're reading. Any questions about number 11? All right, number 12, an atom with an electrical charge. We've already mentioned this. It's an ion. So C is the answer to 12. If you change the number of, electrons, if you have more or less than a proton, then you're going to be negative or positive, and that is an ion. Number 13, how do radioactive isotopes? Nope, not going to talk about that. We don't have time. It won't be on the exam. The bond between oppositely charged ions is a blank bond. It's in the name, ions, so it's an ionic bond. Any questions about number 14? Number 15, I never showed you anything like this in lecture, therefore it won't be on the exam. But what some of you did figure out was that here you can say that this K turned into a positive, right? Right? It became charged. This Br also became charged because it's negative. Therefore, we can deduce that this is an ionic bond, even though you've never seen that before. You should know that that's an ionic bond because you can see that those ions came together to form this compound, this ionic compound. But again, that won't be on the exam. Number 16, what name is given? Okay, if you're talking about sharing electrons, it's covalent. So you need to know that. So up here we talked about ionic, where you give up electrons or take electrons and you become charged, right? You become ions. That's an ionic bond. When you're sharing electrons, it's covalent. And remember that prefix co, right? Like if you cohabitate, you share an apartment, right? If you're, you get the picture. So any questions about number 16? All right, number 17, sulfur has an atomic number of 16. How many covalent bonds can it form? You'll probably get some version of this. If its atomic number is 16, we know that it has 16 protons. And because we didn't say anything about it being charged, we know that it also has 16 electrons. So we know it has 2 on the inside. All right, and then we know the next ring holds 8, right? So 2 plus 8 is 10. So that means we're only dealing with 6 more. So the outermost ring holds 6 electrons, or it has 6 electrons, right? But it needs a total of 8. So that means it needs 2 more. Therefore, it can bond 2 times. And I know I said that quickly, and it would be better if you saw me write it down, but we already talked about that in lecture, and you did that in lab too. So are there any questions about number 17? All right. Yeah, let's move forward then. Obviously, if you get this question, it won't be about sulfur. I'll change the element so you have different numbers to work with. Number 18, the hydrogen and oxygen. Here's one that people missed, and I said this in lecture. I said you guys are going to miss this on the study guide, and you're going to miss this on the exam. And many people did. So read this carefully. The hydrogen and oxygen atoms of a water molecule, are held together by blank bonds. So we're talking about one water molecule. So what's holding the hydrogen and the oxygen together? Covalent bonds. It's covalent bonds that keep one water molecule together. The hydrogen is covalently bonded to the oxygen, which is covalently bonded to the other hydrogen. So the answer to number 18 is C, covalent. Now, then you move to question 19. If we're not talking about one water molecule anymore, if we're talking about adjacent water molecules, right? Multiple water molecules interacting with each other, that is a hydrogen bond, right? So if it's multiple water molecules, like the partially negative oxygen that is attracted to the partially positive hydrogen of another atom, that's a hydrogen bond. So please keep that in mind for the exam. Some people did put polar for this, and I like that. I mean, it's the wrong answer, but at least you're on the right track. Because remember, the fact that water is a polar molecule is what allows those hydrogen bonds to happen, because there's an unequal sharing of the electrons, because the electrons hang out more towards the oxygen than they do the negative, the hydrogen. So any questions about 18 or 19?
Yes.
Yes.
Could you back up to 18 real quick?
Yeah.
Okay, 18. The hydrogen and oxygen atoms of a water molecule, that's saying one, are held together by covalent. And when you had my question is, when you had us drawing out the formula like C6 or H2O or whatever, when you draw one line, that represents covalent.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a covalent bond.
Okay, and then when you draw two lines, it was like the equal sign. That was the hydrogen. For number 19.
Oh, yeah. Well, you guys didn't draw out. You never drew hydrogen bonds in
Okay.
lab. I've shown you a couple hydrogen bonds, and that's represented with dots. So it's like an H and then dot 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 an O.
Okay.
But you're not required to know that.
I got you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. All right. Number 20, we already talked about this like just a second ago. Why is water a polar molecule? The most common wrong answer, and I like it because it was on the right track, was both hydrogen atoms are at one end of the molecule and oxygen is at the other end. That is a true statement, and that is part of the reason. But more importantly, the oxygen end of the molecule has a slight negative charge and the hydrogen end has a slight positive charge. So at least if you got D, you should feel good about yourself because that was a true statement. And if it wasn't for that, then we wouldn't have the fact that one end is more negative and one is more positive. But the proper answer is C. So any questions about number 20? Number 21 is kind of re-asking the same question that we talked about earlier. Excuse me. Adjacent water molecules interact through what? Earlier, we said hydrogen bonds, and that was the correct answer. But now, instead of just saying hydrogen bonds, we're kind of looking to describe what a hydrogen bond is. It's not the sharing of electrons because that would be a molecular bond. Let's see, electrical attraction between hydrogen of one molecule and oxygen of another. Boom. So the answer is B. Again, it's not C because you're not sharing electrons because that would be a covalent bond. And hydrogen's not going to be attracted to another hydrogen because they're both positive and those will repel each other. So the answer to number 21 is B, the electrical attraction between the hydrogen of one water molecule and the oxygen of another. Any questions about that? Number 22, you'll learn that in chemistry. You'll never need to know that in here. How many oxygen atoms? Basically, you're supposed to count them up. Like there's one in that one in this water molecule, one in this molecule, two in this molecule, and 6 in this water molecule. Then you have to multiply the fact that there's 6 of these molecules and 6 of those molecules, and you add it all up. Anyway, you won't have to worry about that in this exam. Here's one that is definitely important. You need to know what happens when a base or an acid is added to a buffered solution. Because remember, a buffered solution resists the changes in pH. Therefore, a buffered solution is kind of going to do the opposite of what you do to it. So if you add a base to it, that means you are adding OH minus to the solution, right? So what's the buffer solution going to do that's the opposite of adding OH minus, right? It's not going to donate these OH minus, these hydroxide, because that's what the base is doing. So it's not going to add to the problem. It's going to do the opposite. So A is not the answer. It's not going to accept water molecules. One might say that it makes water molecules, but we never really talked about that in lecture, so you can ignore that one. Here we go. Here's the opposite of a base, donating H plus ions, which is basically making it more acidic. You put in a base, you make it basic. The buffer adds H plus ions, and it makes it acidic. So it does the opposite. So again, the answer to 23 is C. Now think about all the different ways I could reword this. Instead of asking about a base, I could ask about an acid. Or if I continue to talk about a base, I could say, instead of saying donate OH minus ions, I could say accepts OH minus ions, right? And then in which case that would be correct. So any questions about number 23? All right, number 24, the answer is just simply D, 70 to 95%. Body cells are approximately 70 to 95% water. And I do like, I think the most common wrong answer I saw was this, 95 to 99. At least you were slightly within the range. But But the problem is that's too narrow. First of all, there's all kinds of different body cells. You know, there's cells in your hair versus cells in your eyeballs versus cells in your stomach, right? So some of them are going to have more water than others. And then you have to think about the fact that there's so many different people. So, and then any given day, some days you're more hydrated than other days, right? So think about that. Hopefully that helps you remember that there's a wide variety, a wide range, and it's 70 to 95. Any questions about number 24? All right, we never talked about this. Which of the following is an acid? So you're not going to get this question on the exam. But if you're a thinker, you might properly have guessed it, and I think a couple people did. The answer is C, because it has that hydrogen atom that might be donated. Here, hopefully you would recognize that OH and think, oh yeah, that might be a base. And again, hopefully you'd see that H and think, that might be an acid. But then again, the methane right there has H's too. So again, that's why that question won't be on the exam. I didn't teach that to you. The tendency of molecules of the same kind to stick together. So here we go. Same kind, not different kinds, but same kind. The answer is cohesion, right? But because they're the same kind. So when a water molecule sticks to a water molecule, that is cohesion. When a water molecule sticks to a glass jar, that is adhesion, because that's, when you stick to something that's different. So any questions about number 26? I won't ask you about adhesion. Just know what cohesion is. Okay. I never specifically showed you anything like this on in the lecture, but I did show you a chemical reaction, and I did tell you that in this class, reactants will always be on the left, products will always be on the right, and the arrow always points away from the reactants and towards the products. So even though you've never seen this before, you should have recognized it for that reason. And the question is, what are the reactants? So it's these, right? The C6H12O6 and this H2O and this O2. So the answer is B. So you should know that for the exam, not those specific equations, but any equation you see, the reactants will be on the left and the products will be on the right. The arrow will always point away from the reactants and to the products. So any questions about number 27? 28, I probably won't ask you, so I'm not going to explain it. I'll just give it to you. Some tiny insects are able to walk on water. Why? We talked about it in lecture. It is because there's surface tension. That is the result of water's cohesive properties, right? So water sticks together. Therefore, it's got a relatively strong surface tension, meaning it's hard to break the surface, relatively hard to break the surface. Therefore, all these light, tiny insects can stand on the water and not break that surface tension. Number 29, what happens when water freezes? You should know this because we talked about the biological importance of water freezing. And before we talked about why it was important, we talked about how it happened. The reason water floats is the reason ice floats is because it is less dense than water, liquid water. And the reason it is less dense than liquid water is because when it freezes, the molecules move farther apart. So the answer to 29 is A. Any questions about that? I like the B and C. I like that they added those as options because you could put like what happens when water evaporates. Even though we didn't talk about that in the lecture, then you could say it cools the surrounding environment and its hydrogen bonds break apart. But an evaporate is basically sort of the opposite of freezing, depending on how you look at it. But anyway, number 30, you do need to know this, not necessarily sugar dissolved in coffee, but what you do need to know is if you mix something in a liquid to create something else, right? Let's just put it this way. The coffee, right? The coffee is the solvent because that's the thing doing the dissolving. The sugar is the solute because that is the thing being dissolved. And the sweetened coffee is the solute because that's the new solution, right? That's the thing that the sweetened coffee is the solution because that's the stuff you made. So you do need to know some version of that. You put a solute into a solvent, right? And the solvent dissolves the solute. And when that happens, you then get a solution. So any questions about number 30? It's 4:50. I mean, no one's required to be here anyway. So I would say you can get off, but you can leave whenever you want. But I'm going to keep going because I want to answer any questions you might have. And anybody watching the video, as opposed to being online or live in person or online right now, you can fast forward and hear me talk quickly and get through this quicker. Anyway, a base, like I said, you need to know what a base does. It does not take away water. It does not decrease the pH, right? It increases the pH. It does not remove OH ions. It adds them. There we go. It removes H plus ions from a solution. So yes, when you study this question, think about all the different ways I could reword this, and think about the fact that I might ask about an acid instead of a base. So yes, a base does remove H plus ions, but I could also just as equally or just as accurately say a base. I don't want to confuse it. Let's leave it at that. I won't reword that one too much. Any questions about number 31? All right, number 32. I'm probably not going to ask this on the exam, but the whole idea about number 32, even though we briefly talked about ocean acidification, I told you wouldn't need to know about ocean acidification. That was just an example. But that being said, there is some stuff you should know in this question. So ocean acidification, that name should tell you that we're talking about making the ocean more acidic, right? Therefore, we know A is not the correct option, because if you're making the ocean more acidic, then you're not going to decrease the H plus concentrations. You're going to increase it. So we know that's not it. Coral bleaching, maybe. But again, I didn't talk too much about it, so I don't expect you to know about that. Changes in the metabolism of marine animals. Again, I didn't really talk about that, so I don't expect you to know that. But here's the thing that you should have known. It increases the carbonic acid concentration. More specifically, forget everything else. You can read this and say it increases the acid concentrations. Therefore, that must be the right answer. Because I'm not expecting you to know anything about the effects of coral or of ocean acidification. You just need to know if something is being acidified, then you are increasing the H plus concentrations. You are increasing the acid concentrations. So any questions about 32? All right, here's one that people are going to miss on the exam. I'm going to change the numbers, and I'll change the numbers. But relative to a pH of 7, a pH of 4 has what? So let's look at the numbers. We're going from 7 to 4. So 6 is one step, 5 is another step, 4. So that's 3 steps. And each step is a change of 10. So 10, 100, 1,000. So right off the bat, I know the answer to number 34 needs to be 1,000 something, right? I know that needs to be the number. And then let's figure the rest out. Well, there we go. This one was kind of easy because there's only one that has 1,000, right? So yeah, right off the bat, by process of elimination, we know the answer is B because it's the only one that has 1,000. However, my exam's not going to be that easy. I'll probably have more than one answer that has the correct number on it. So then the question is, like, you might get another option that says, relative to a pH of 7, a pH of 4 has a 1,000 times higher H plus concentration, or it might say 1,000 times lower H concentration, right? In which case, that would be the wrong one, right? Because it does not have a lower H plus concentration. It has a higher H plus concentration because it is acidic. So keep that in mind. Also, I might not say higher H plus concentration. I might say higher acidity, or I might say lower. I'll just leave it at that. We don't have time to get through it. Just think about all the different ways I could reword that question. Any questions about number 34?
Yes, right quick. Again, on that scale, on that pH scale from 0 to 14, the lower the number, the more acidic.
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah, another way to think about that. That's another good way to try to say what I was saying, but more succinctly. So the lower the number, the more acidic, the less basic, the more H plus ions, and the fewer OH minus ions. That would be the lower numbers, right? And then the higher the number, the less acidic, the more basic, the fewer H plus ions, and the more OH minus ions. So think about, there's all those different ways of saying the same thing, right? Higher number, lower number. A higher acidity, lower acidity. More basic, less basic. So just think about all that for the exam.
Yep. Roger that.
All right. Number 35. What name is given to a substance that resists changes in pH? That's just buffers. You should know that. We talked about that in the lab, even though our experiment didn't really work out for us. What is the outcome of evaporative cooling? You should know that. Basically, why do you sweat? To cool yourself down. It decreases the body temperature. Radiometric dating, we're not going to talk about, won't be on the exam. An atom has 20 protons, 20 neutrons, 20 electrons. What atom is being described? This should be a really easy one for you. You know that it has 20 protons, therefore its atomic number must be 20. So the answer has to be B. And if you get a question like that, it'll be that simple, but it won't be calcium. It'll be something else with a different number. But yeah, protons is the same thing as the atomic number. 40 we won't talk about, won't be on the exam. People miss this question on the study guide. Again, we're talking about pH scale. How does apple juice compare to lemon juice? This goes back to what I was saying earlier. First of all, we're going from apple to lemon, so that's one step. So we know that's a times 10 change. So we know right off the bat that it's either going to be B or D. And then we know also that it's going down. So, excuse me, we're comparing apple to lemon, right? So we know because apple is higher than lemon. We know that apple is less acidic than lemon juice. We know that apple is more basic than lemon juice. We know that apple has a smaller concentration of H plus ions than lemon juice. We know that apple has a higher concentration of OH minus ions than lemon juice. So all those different ways of saying the same thing. So any questions about number 41? All right, we're making good time. This will not be on the exam because it's only 50 minutes, so you don't have time to read all this and then answer questions, but I really quickly will talk about what the correct answers are because these are important concepts for the exam. She's taking a glass of ice. She's taking a drink from a glass of ice water. The ice is floating. Why is it floating? We already talked about that earlier because the density of water decreases when it freezes, right? Water, when it freezes, it becomes less dense. Therefore, it floats. Why did the sweat on her forearms form drops? The most common wrong answer I got for that was because of the ability of water to moderate heat. That would be the correct answer if the question was, why did she sweat, right? You sweat to moderate heat, but that's not the question. The question is, why did the sweat drops? Why did the sweat come together to form drops? And that is because of the cohesive nature of water. So any questions about those two questions? All right, we are really making good time. I'm going to knock chapter 3 out here really quickly. Chapter 3 study guide, view material. Here we go. All right, this one's shuffled. So if you're following along and you're trying to go off my video and see your study guide, then I apologize. Wait, you know what? I'll do it this way. We'll just look at, okay, here we go. Lactose intolerance. We're not going to talk about that for the exam. We might revisit that later with natural selection. Here we go. You do need to know this. This is the only atom where I've actually told you need to know how many bonds it can make. And it's carbon. It can make 4 bonds. Hopefully you remember that from the exam or from the lab. But it's important, right? Carbon's a very important molecule, and that's the only one that I said you need to know. So carbon, 4. Any questions about that? 23, or excuse me, number 3. You don't need to know this for the exam. I'm not going to ask you, but hopefully from the lab, you recognize the fact that there's no oxygens on here, so that's not going to be a carbohydrate. Hopefully, and this is going to require some deep thinking, but I'll go ahead and say it. You know that proteins, you need to know that proteins are made up of amino acids, and every amino acid is a carbon, right? Bonded to 4 different things. One of those 4 different things it's bonded to is a amino group, and an amino group has a nitrogen. We see no nitrogens in this, so we know it's not a protein. I didn't even teach you about inorganic compounds, so that's off the table. So the answer is C, organic compound. And again, that question won't be on the exam, but I did want to talk about it because all that stuff I just told you is important information for the exam. So any questions about number 3? Oh, by the way, it's organic because it's got a bunch of carbons, right? Carbon, organic compounds are carbon-based, so that's why it's organic. And we already talked about why it's not proteins, why it's not carbs, why it's not inorganic. You do not need to know what a hydroxyl group is, so let's just skip that. 5. I'm not going to ask you this either because you did not need to memorize the fact that galactose was a monomer, or that the only monosaccharide I think you needed to know was glucose. So I'm just going to skip number 5. That won't be on the exam. Number 6, you do need to know this. Remember, if you go through a reaction and you create a water molecule, that is dehydration, right? On the opposite, if you use water molecules in the reactants, then that is hydrolysis. So the answer to this number 6 is dehydration. If water is on the product side of the reaction, then it is dehydration. If water is on the reactant side, it is hydrolysis. These other two are just filler. So any questions about number 6?
Yes.
Yes.
Number 6. So if the question read after reaction, if it would have said water plus lactose, it would have been hydrolysis?
Yep, and that is a reaction too. So if it said lactose plus water and then an arrow going towards galactose and glucose, then yes, that would be hydrolysis. And that is and that's what your body does too. When you eat lactose, that's exactly what happens. It breaks it down to galactose and glucose by using a water molecule. And yes, that is hydrolysis.
That is, sir.
Great question. Carbs typically include what? And the answer is B. I'm not sure I'm going to ask you that, but yeah, the answer is B, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And that was, you should just be familiar with that from the lab. Number 8, what name is given to the following reaction? We've already talked. I'm not going to require you to know this. So yes, I am. I'm sorry. Again, water is on the left-hand side of the equation. That's all you need to know. Forget everything else. Water is in the reactants. Therefore, the answer is hydrolysis. Any questions about number 8? Number 9, I'm not going to ask you because I did not require you to memorize the examples of isomers I gave you. You should know that an isomer has the same chemical formula but a different structure. But again, I did not require you to memorize which ones were isomers and which ones weren't. So we're going to skip number 9. 10 we might have. The idea here is mono plus mono. 1 plus 1 equals what? 2. Therefore, the answer is A, disaccharide. Any questions about number 10? All right, number 11. What can you conclude about the following reaction? Glucose and lactose are both disaccharides. No, that's not even true. This is an example of hydrolysis. Nope, that's not true because we know it's dehydration. Lactose is a disaccharide. Glucose is a monosaccharide. No, you can't really figure that out. Lactose and glucose are both polysaccharides. You know what? This question's not going to be on there. But yeah, the answer is lactose is a disaccharide and glucose is a monosaccharide. But the only way you could even come to that conclusion is the fact that you should know that because it's a dehydration reaction, that you're bringing something together. So hopefully then you would just know that a monomer plus a monomer equals a disaccharide in this case. But I'm not going to ask you that. Number 12, table sugar. I might ask you this only because I mentioned it because it's so important. It's the most common example of a disaccharide there is. So maybe I'll ask you, but table sugar is sucrose, a disaccharide. Any questions about number 12? All right, number 13, a protein's function is dependent on environmental factors such as pH and temperature. We talked about that yesterday. What property of the protein itself dictates the protein's function? And I said if you were taking notes, you could shorthand this, and you should. A protein's function is determined by its shape. So the answer is B, shape. Any questions about number 13? 14, I won't ask you, but I did mention this in the lecture. Fiber is good for you, right? And fiber is cellulose, and cellulose is a polysaccharide. So anyway, that's the answer to that. Which is an example of a polysaccharide. Sure, you might get it. Yeah, you'll probably get some question like this because we talked about 3 of them, and you needed to know about each one of them. You need to know about starch, which is the energy storage for plants. Yeah, so that's the answer to that one. But I could put glycogen in there, or I could put cellulose in there. And either one of those would be correct. So any questions about number 15? All right, like I just said when I was talking about number 15, what do plants use to store energy? Starch. The answer is C. Any questions about that? Again, I've already discussed this. Cellulose is what? Cellulose is the polysaccharide. Any questions about that? All right, which of these is hydrophilic? Hopefully you remember that I said that all carbohydrates are hydrophilic, and hopefully you remember that cellulose is a carbohydrate, in which case you would know the answer is A. But also, hopefully you remember that testosterone is a steroid, and a steroid is a lipid, and a lipid is hydrophobic, so that's not it. Hopefully you remember that butter is a triglyceride, and a triglyceride is a lipid, which is hydrophobic, so that's not it. Same thing with testosterone or cholesterol. Hopefully you remember that it is a steroid, and a steroid is a lipid, and a lipid is hydrophobic. Basically, here we have 3 lipids and something that isn't a lipid, and what can usually help you in any multiple choice, one of these things is not like the other, and that would be A. Cellulose is different than the rest of these. Any questions about number 18?
Right quick. Hydrophilic accepts water. Hydrophobic is it rejects water.
Yeah, you could. Yep. Hydrophilic. Just think about like anything that you've heard the word phobic. If you're agoraphobic, you're afraid of heights. If you're arachnophobic, you're afraid of spiders. So you could think of these 3 things as hydrophobic. You could almost think of them as afraid of water. I mean, they don't have emotions, so they're not afraid, but they don't mix with water. So just remember phobic. And I hate to use this term, but probably the most well-known philic term would be a pedophile, right? That's somebody who is attracted to young people. So philic means love or attracted to. Phobic means, not attracted to or afraid of. Number 19, sometimes, this is a long one. Sometimes when I have my morning coffee, I notice the thin film floating on top of the coffee, blah, blah, blah. Basically, what is the thin film that's on the coffee? And hopefully you would know because, you've got liquid in there and maybe some sugar. You talked about that. No cream or sugar. You would know that because it's not mixing with the water, the coffee, which is basically water with some grounds in it, that it would be hydrophobic because it's not mixing with the water. Any questions about number 19, which won't be on the exam? All right, 20 won't be on the exam, but I did say high saturated fats aren't bad for you, so just know that for your life. 21, a fat contains which molecular components? You do need to know this. It is 3 fatty acids and a glycerol molecule. Because remember, I said you needed to know for all 4 categories of the biological molecules what they're made of, right? So a triglyceride, a fat, contains 3 fatty acids and a glycerol molecule. Any questions about number 21? All right, here we go again with the same question, asked a different way. Triglyceride plus 3 water molecules. The water molecules are on the right. Therefore, you know it's a dehydration reaction. Also, given the question right before it, we know that a glycerol and 3 fatty acids come together to make a triglyceride. And hopefully you know by now that when you bring molecules together to build a larger molecule, that's a dehydration reaction. So any questions about number 22? All right, 23 is pretty straightforward. You need to know it. What are saturated fats saturated with? Hydrogen, right? Every single carbon is either bonded to only, just know that they're saturated with hydrogen. We won't have time to talk about what we've already talked about. Any questions about number 23? 24 is kind of asking the same question, just in a different way. By definition, what type of fatty acid has a double bond? It is unsaturated because you'll have a carbon double bonded to another carbon. So that right there is 2 carbons that could have had a bond to a hydrogen but don't. Therefore, it's not saturated with hydrogens. Therefore, it is unsaturated. Any questions about number 24? 25 I won't ask you probably, but again, this is kind of like one of these things is not like the other thing, sort of. What is the lowest in unsaturated fats? So basically you could say, what is the highest in saturated fats? And the answer is beef. Because remember, I told you should associate animals with saturated fats. And then I did give the exception of fish, right? And salmon is a fish, therefore it is the exception. So any questions about number 25? All right, When you hydrogenate something, you're turning it from unsaturated to saturated, right? So you're putting hydrogen atoms on it. So a fat that is completely hydrogenated, therefore it would be saturated. So we can get rid of A and B as the option. And then we're looking at, is it solid at room temperature or is it liquid at room temperature? And you need to remember that saturated fats are solid at room temperature because of their shape, right? They're straight fatty acids, so you can stack them on top of each other. So they are solid at room temperature. Any questions about number 26? 27 is pretty straightforward too. You definitely should recognize sucrose as a carbohydrate. You should definitely recognize amino acids as the building block of a protein. Maybe you should definitely recognize the fact that butter is a fat, right? It has fat in it. So then also, hopefully you recognize the fact that estrogen is a steroid. The only ones we talked about were estrogen, cholesterol, and testosterone. So that's not a big list to memorize. So any questions about number 27? 28, we're going to have a whole chapter based on or devoted to RNA and DNA, so I might not ask any questions about it. But RNA is not double-stranded, so that's not right. No, protein is the polymer of amino acids, not RNA, so that's not right. RNA contains a U, DNA contains a T. That is correct. So there you go. The answer to that is C. I probably won't ask that in this exam. That'll come later. Your friend has mood swings. It's reasonable for you to suspect your friend has begun to take what, right? They've got mood swings. They've been putting on a lot of muscle. So the answer is obviously anabolic steroids. That won't be on the exam. Enzymes, we'll really haven't got into those too much. We'll talk about them more in the next chapter. So this probably won't be on the exams, but just so you know for now, enzymes are proteins. So if you guessed amino acids, you're not incorrect, but that wasn't the most correct, right? Because amino acids make up proteins and enzymes are proteins. Here's something you do need to know. What are proteins made of? They're made up of amino acids, just like I said. So the answer to 31 is B, amino acids. It's not monosaccharides because that's what makes up carbohydrates. It's not nucleotides because that's what makes up nucleic acids. And it's not fatty acids because that's what makes up triglycerides. Any questions about 31? Here we go. The same question asked in a different way. What is the name given to the reaction that breaks peptide bonds? Well, what is the name of the reaction that breaks any kind of bonds that we've learned about in this chapter? And the answer is hydrolysis. If you're breaking bonds, it's hydrolysis. Any questions about that? Lactose intolerance, we won't talk about. I might bring it back up when we talk about natural selection. Number 35 is not going to be on there. It's too long for a 50-minute exam. But if you have a bacteria that functions properly at 100 degrees Celsius, which is boiling point, and then you compare that to a human bacteria, a human cell, obviously the bacteria is going to function better at 100 degrees Celsius than a human cell, because humans don't live in boiling water. Nucleic acids are polymers of what? And the answer is nucleotide. You need to know that. The DNA is a type of nucleic acid. Fatty acids are what make up triglycerides. Monosaccharides make up polysaccharides, right? Carbohydrates. So the answer to 36 is D, nucleotide. Any questions about that? 37 will be for another chapter, another exam. 38, probably I won't ask you this until later in the semester as well, but if you remember, DNA has T, G, A, and C. So the answer to that would be B. I'm probably not going to ask you. I'm not going to ask you about lactose intolerance. Definitely don't need to know this until the later chapters. This is a good one. Glucose is the starch as blank as the protein. So we know that glucose, a bunch of glucose strung together makes a starch. So what are a bunch of things that are strung together to make proteins? The answer is C, amino acids. Yes, amino acids are strung together to make a polypeptide, but then once that polypeptide is formed and folded in the right way, it is then a protein. So the answer is amino acids. Any questions about number 41? All right, lactose intolerance, skipping it. Main sugar found in milk, skipping it. DNA, skipping that. You'll need to know that later in the semester. Same with number 45. 46, you do not need to know anything about fructose or mannose or glucose. What you do need to know is these things all have the same chemical formula, and you can see that they look different. Doesn't even matter how they're different. You just know that they're different. Therefore, we know that they are they have the same formula but different structures, right? Those things are isomers. Any questions about that? All right. So here we have, hopefully you should recognize this. You do need to recognize this as a nucleotide, or excuse me, a polynucleotide, because there's a nucleotide, there's one, right? You can see the sugar phosphate backbone. And then you can look at the letters and see that there's an A, a G, a T, right? Oh, there's a T. We know if it has a T that it must not be an RNA, it must be DNA. And we know because there's only one of these strands that it has to be a single strand of DNA. So the answer to that is C. Any questions about number 47? You guys don't need to worry about this 3' and 5' stuff. That's not important. Maleic acid is a fatty acid that occurs naturally in many animal and vegetable fats and oils. What can you tell about oleic acid just by looking at its structure? It is an unsaturated fatty acid. That is correct, because that carbon could have had another hydrogen, so could that one, but instead they're double bonded to each other. Therefore, it is unsaturated. Yeah, there we go. Any questions about that? The female hormone progesterone, which you can see right here, is involved in the menstrual cycle and pregnancy. Based on its structure, what type of macromolecule is it? And again, hopefully you should recognize the fact that there's these 1, 2, 3, 4 rings, and that is a steroid. There's not much to say. Again, you should know that a fat is a glycerol and 3 fatty acids. You should know that a protein is a string of amino acids. You should know that a polysaccharide is a string of monosaccharides. So yeah, those are the 2 different ways that you should know the answer is B, steroid. Even if you don't recognize that as steroid, you should recognize this not as any of these other 3 things. So any questions about anything? We are now done with all the study guides. Great. So listen, if there's any problems with the exam, like today, obviously I had problems logging on. If there's any problems with the exam, just keep looking at your email, wait for it to pop up, and we'll deal with the problems as they come. Just try your best. After 8:50 in the morning, you're no longer required to be doing biology. So be done, and we'll fix any problems we might come across. But does anybody have any questions?
Yes. So you're saying you're going to send the exam via email instead of on the classwork?
No, it'll be, what happens is I'm going to post it to Google Classroom.
Okay.
And what happens when I do that, it automatically sends you an email. Just like yesterday, you guys automatically got an email that said I posted lab number 4. Right? Okay.
Right.
Yeah. And I had scheduled that. I was not behind my computer at 2 p.m. when that happened. I did that like a few days ago. So same thing with the exam. I'm going to finish it up tonight. I'm going to schedule it to post probably like at 7:50 a.m. Because sometimes it doesn't post right on time. And then once you see it pop up, either in Google Classroom or in your email, either way, you just log on there and take it.
Hey, thanks for taking the time out and giving us this. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. I'll probably be busy tonight, but if you guys have questions, it won't hurt to email me. And if I can, I'll try to help you. But I'm just going ahead and warning you right now, I might not be able to. So good luck tomorrow, everybody. And I'll see you online or in person.